The relentless sun of southern Oklahoma cast shimmering shadows across the dusty streets of Tulsa. But in late May of 1921, the heat wasn't solely from the celestial body above. It was the heat of foreboding, the air as taut as a drawn string, thick with the tension that had been accumulating for years, decades, even centuries. At the very moment the world was poised to celebrate victory in the Great War, a nightmare was brewing in the heart of America, in a thriving district known as Black Wall Street. This Black Wall Street was more than just a neighborhood. It was a living symbol, a symbol of the unyielding perseverance, entrepreneurship, and boundless hope of the African American community. A community that, in defiance of all the barriers of racial segregation, had managed to build its own world of prosperity. Here stood black churches, black shops beckoned with their warmth, black schools imparted knowledge, and black hospitals healed ailments. Here lived doctors with skillful hands, lawyers with persuasive words, and businessmen with sharp minds. They were building their future upon land that had once seemed to reject them. And the most brilliant beacon of this rapid prosperity was the majestic skyscraper White Plaza, its floors soaring toward the sky, a visible monument to their indomitable ambitions. But alas, such prosperity could not help but stir burning envy. In a land where the white population reigned supreme, any display of black excellence, even in seemingly minor details, was not merely unwelcome. It was utterly unthinkable, a disruption of the established order. The tension, like a tautly drawn string, grew, fueled by decades of discrimination, irrational fear, and a twisted, deeply ingrained sense of superiority. And as so often happens in history, the spark capable of igniting a true blaze can sometimes be incredibly insignificant. Legend has it that it all began with a seemingly trivial skirmish. On the 30th of May, 1921, a 19-year-old African-American youth named Dick Rowland, a humble shoemaker, entered an elevator cabin in the Delmar building. There, he encountered 17-year-old Bessie Banks, a young white girl who worked as an elevator operator. What precisely transpired between them in those fleeting seconds remains a mystery, shrouded in numerous conflicting accounts. Was it a careless word, dropped in haste, or perhaps an unintended touch, crossing unseen social lines? Or could it have been something far more sinister? The accounts that have survived differ, leaving this scene shrouded in mystery. No sooner had Rowland been shown the door than Bess made her way directly to her manager and then to the police station. There, she filed a report for assault. Dick Rowland was arrested. The news of what was called a white woman's assault on a black man swept through Tulsa with the speed of a wildfire consuming dry prairie. For the city's white population, it was a bitter confirmation of their deepest fears and ingrained prejudices. For the black residents, it was another painful instance of stark injustice, an unambiguous threat to their safety, and a chilling reminder of the precariousness of their standing in society. The following day, the 31st of May, a heated crowd of white citizens, armed and filled with fierce malice, gathered at the prison where Rowland was held. They furiously demanded Rowland's release, eager to enact vigilante justice upon him. At that very moment, approximately 100 armed black men, having learned of the looming threat, also assembled at the prison walls, determined to protect Rowland. They sincerely believed that justice should have the opportunity to carry out its fair work, and that their own, albeit limited, rights must be inviolably upheld. In that precise instant, as the two opposing groups met face to face, the air was torn by the unfolding chaos. A shot rang out. It was impossible to ascertain precisely whose hand pulled the trigger first, who exactly initiated this brutal struggle. but it no longer held any meaning. The crowds, consumed by blind rage and soul-chilling fear, transformed into an uncontrollable force, sweeping everything in its path. What followed was not merely a spontaneous riot. It was a meticulously planned, ruthless assault. Waves of unbridled violence swept across the legendary Black Wall Street. White mobs, armed to the teeth with firearms, unflinchingly set fire to homes, shops, and even churches sacred to the community. They shot indiscriminately at anyone who dared cross their bloody path. Unimaginable chaos filled the air. A cacophony of desperate screams, mournful cries, the deafening roar of gunfire, and the sinister crackle of burning wood. Countless African Americans, driven by the instinct of self-preservation, desperately tried to defend their families and possessions. They returned fire, but the odds were fatally unbalanced. Most black residents were unarmed or equipped only with crude, makeshift weapons. Meanwhile, the white mobs were expertly armed, receiving support from elements of the city's law enforcement, as well as from armed groups arriving from neighboring counties, many of whom were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Picture this scene. Streets that mere hours before had pulsed with life, filled with laughter and bustling commerce, had now transformed into a veritable battlefield. Fierce flames relentlessly devoured homes, surging towards the heavens in pillars of acrid black smoke. People fled in panic, saving what was most precious, their very lives, leaving behind all they had built over years, all to which they had grown attached. Children, gripped by terror, cried out, lost in this pitch-black inferno. Mothers, trembling with fear, tried to shield their tiny infants, clutching them as their only salvation. Men engaged in battle, aware of the slim chance of victory, but the resolve to not bow before the enemy was stronger than their fear. The merciless struggle raged throughout the entire night, continuing into the waning hours of the following day. The city authorities, instead of halting this nightmare, had in essence given it their silent approval. The governor of Oklahoma, faced with such a situation, declared martial law and dispatched the National Guard to the streets. However, the arriving soldiers, as it turned out, largely shared the sentiments of the white population. They offered support to armed white groups, unhesitatingly arresting black citizens, including those who dared to stand up for their rights and defend their homes. This thriving heart of the black community, known as Black Wall Street, was almost completely obliterated. At least 35 city blocks were reduced to rubble. Thousands of black residents were left with nothing. No homes, no possessions, stripped of everything they had built through years of diligent labor. Official records stated 36 lives were lost in this bloody massacre, 26 black individuals and 10 white individuals. However, many historians and survivors believe the death toll was far greater, numbering in the hundreds, perhaps even thousands. The fallen were laid to rest in mass graves, and countless acts of violence went unrecorded. What drove these white people, who so ferociously descended upon their neighbors? It was more than just anger, more than just envy. Deeply embedded within their actions was ingrained racial hatred, a fear of losing their privileges, and an unshakable belief in racial superiority. So potent it compelled them to commit horrific atrocities. They saw the achievements of African Americans not as accomplishments, but as a threat to their established way of life, their worldview, their power. Following the bloody carnage, there was an attempt to cover up what had happened. Dick Rowland was released from prison due to a lack of evidence proving his guilt. Later, Bessie Bass confessed that Rowland had not touched her. However, this admission offered no comfort. Many African Americans, who had merely tried to defend themselves, were tried for riot and murder. They were convicted and sent to prison. Meanwhile, those who had openly led the violence, who had set fire to homes and committed murders, remained unpunished. This was not simply a crime, it was a profound trauma. A trauma for the entire African American community, leaving behind deep, unhealed scars. It was entirely unsurprising that many of the survivors were too frightened to speak, too deeply traumatized to even recall those horrific events. It seemed easier for them to forget, to try and rebuild their lives among the ruins, rather than to fight a system so clearly against them. Yet, despite every attempt to silence them, this horror could not remain buried forever. Generations later, people finally began to speak. We started to relentlessly seek the truth, to demand justice that seemed so unattainable. Meticulous research began. Long investigations and invaluable pain-filled testimonies from survivors were gathered. It was then that it became crystal clear. The Tulsa Massacre was not merely some localized, isolated incident. It turned out to be one of the most horrific, most widespread mass killings committed out of blind racial hatred in the entire long history of the United States. This case, unfortunately, never received the proper attention, the recognition that it undoubtedly deserves. It was ruthlessly pushed out of collective public memory, as if deliberately hidden beneath the dusty rug of history. But despite this, it serves as a vivid, poignant reminder of the monstrous consequences that can arise from the triumph of hatred and deeply entrenched prejudice. It reminds us of the precariousness, the fragility of the world we try to build, of the enduring importance of the relentless fight for justice. And that truth, however painful, must always be heard. Reflecting on all of this, a poignant question inevitably arises. How many more untold, forgotten stories still lie hidden in the dark depths of the past? How many lives were broken? How many were cut short? How many people became silent victims of quiet, yet no less devastating forms of violence that went unnoticed and unpunished? How often, becoming unwitting witnesses to blatant injustice, do we choose the path of least resistance? Do we prefer to simply turn away, consumed by fear of potential consequences? Or do we console ourselves with the thought that it is, after all, not our problem? The story of Tulsa is not just a tale of a horrific tragedy that befell the black population, but also, without exaggeration, a story of white guilt, of how blinding fear, ingrained prejudice, and all-consuming hatred can not only break the lives of specific people, but also literally trample entire thriving communities. And until we dare to speak openly about these dark, sometimes forgotten pages of our shared history, until we acknowledge them in all their truly monstrous fullness, we condemn ourselves to the bitter repetition of the same mistakes, again and again, day after day. And let the scorching sun of southern Oklahoma continue to pour its light upon these lands. But the memory of what horrifyingly occurred on that fateful May day in 1921 must forever illuminate our path, guiding us toward building a more just and most